Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Introduction to American Government. Today, I want to spend some time discussing parties, why people associate with parties, what are parties, how do parties influence government, and the like. So, fundamentally, political parties are what we call endemic to democracy. There are no democracies without political parties. In the rare cases that they are, it is usually the case that it's very early in that democracy's history or there are other legal prescriptions surrounding political parties. Even looking at American history, obviously, you are very likely familiar with George Washington's famous caution against factionalism, generally interpreted to be against political parties. But even within the Washington cabinet, there was controversy, there was disagreement between the more Federalists and the more what would come to be known as the Democratic Republican wings of the Washington cabinet. When we look back throughout history, going back to even all the way back to Athens with the Plains faction, with the Coast faction, with the Hill faction, going to Rome, you're very likely familiar with the story of Julius Caesar. The story of Julius Caesar is someone who was a reformer, someone who we might today consider to be a liberal, going against the conservative faction. Moving ahead to Byzantium, many other places around history. Wherever there is democracy, there are political parties. And this is basically an essential characteristic of democracy at its core. When we think about democracy, one person, one vote, trying to influence the scope, the function of government. When you have a situation like that, it makes intuitive sense, but it also makes, shall we call it, instrumental or practical sense to band together into factions whether the source of that factionalism, whether that source of those parties is purely geographical or some other identity characteristic, or if that cohesive mechanism, as it is sometimes called, is very much on the basis of what those individuals within that faction want the government to do, be it higher or lower taxes, an additional policy, whatever it might be. Within the American context, the source of that cohesive mechanism for the parties has varied throughout American history. Early on, the Democratic Republican Party, that's not an oxymoron, there's a dash between them, was dominant for many years. It took until Andrew Jackson to separate into two more parties. For a time, there was the Whigs that came to be replaced by the Republican Party. What these parties stand for very much changes over time. It evolves, it adapts based on everyday conditions, based on what is going on in the country. But the basic idea of groups getting together so that their voice may be greater than the individual sum of its parts, the idea here being collective action, is again endemic to democracy. Now, you might ask, why do we only have two parties in the American system? This is largely a function of our voting system. We in the vast majority of states, plurality voting rules apply, which means whoever gets the most votes wins. Doesn't necessarily have to be 50%, though there are some locations where that is the case and there'll be a runoff if that was not the case. But whoever gets the most votes wins, and they win all of the seats or all of the representation, as it were. Duverger's law posits that as a result of strategic voting, that these plurality systems will necessarily converge to a two-party dominant system. The idea here being that if, for example, you felt the closest affinity to a Green Party candidate, but that Green Party candidate had no practical way of winning, you couldn't see an avenue for them to actually win that election, you would be better served by casting your vote for the party that is closest to your own preference, but has an actual chance of winning. In the American context, that would be the Democratic Party. And so the Green Party's vote is artificially suppressed as a result of the electoral incentives and the electoral realities of that voting system itself. This is why throughout American history, as well as in other countries around the world that use plurality voting systems, that it tends to necessarily converge to a two-party system. Now, when we're talking about those cohesive mechanisms, back in chapter 6, we talked a little bit about ideology, political ideology. In the contemporary American context, the Democratic Party is largely liberal in terms of ideologies, whereas the Republican Party is largely conservative in terms of ideologies. As I mentioned previously, this hasn't always been the case. There's very much been an evolution of the party system throughout American history. But today, Democrats tend to be liberal and and Republicans tend to be conservative. Now, when we're thinking about why people might band together, in the American context, we are an extraordinarily diverse country, not just in terms of ethnicity or race, but in terms of regional desires. Someone living in Kansas, for example, might have a greater emphasis on agricultural subsidies than someone living in Maine, who might want, let's think, like fishing subsidies or support for the fishing industry or something of the like. Within the American context, and because of this two party system, the American party system is what we call big tent. They possess or they collect a lot of non conflicting political positions, preferences, and the like, and bring them all under one big tent. The Democratic and Republican parties have a variety of different positions, different desires, factions with different desires within that broad party label. And when we're thinking about these cohesive mechanisms, yes, ideology, liberalism, conservatism, they serve as certainly as a cohesive force amongst the electorate. For people who are conservative tend to feel better represented by the Republican Party because Republican politicians tend to couch or frame their appeals within language that is more appealing to that ideological framework. Uh, the Republican Party may also prefer or offer policies that are more desirable to conservatives. And the same works in reverse for the Democratic Party. Now, when we're thinking about attachments to parties, when we're thinking about why an individual may choose to identify as a Democrat or as a Republican, this actually operates in a lot of different ways. When we're thinking about the Big Tent style of politics, an individual may have a single issue that they care deeply about. If they're in Kansas and they're a farmer and one party is promising greater agricultural subsidies than the other, they will necessarily attach themselves to that party. They will vote for that party that serves their specific interests. But that's not the only reason that people associate with political parties. As we discussed previously with this discussion on socialization, some people may view themselves as a result of being socialized from an early age as a member of that party. That all of the good feelings, that all of the good things come from or are at least associated with that party. And this kind of hereditary is probably the wrong way to put it, but definitely learned attachment to a party in this way and kind of filtering the entirety of the political environment, of the topics of the day, of the issues through the lens of that party, serves a really strong attachment to that partisan label. But something that we've seen in recent years, that being polarization and specifically effective polarization, is where an individual views their sense of identity as associated with that political party. In decades previously, someone may have identified themselves with a religion or identified themselves with their profession or identified themselves as being of a place, of a specific region, of a specific city, whatever it might be. What we've seen in recent decades, though, is a greater number of people will say, when asked, "What are you?" or "Who are you?" they will say, "I am a Democrat" or "I am a Republican." Their sense of identity is wrapped up inherently with their partisan identification. And this makes the electoral contest, makes elections themselves a referendum on individuals' identity. If your preferred partisan identity loses an election, that is a status threat. That is a threat to you as a person. Moreover, when you have your sense of identity wrapped up in partisanship, when your notion of self comes from that partisan identification, it becomes very difficult to really understand how someone could choose to associate with the other party. And you begin to make moral, ethical, and fundamentally character judgments about those who associate or identify with the other party. It's not just that they disagree with you on something, it's not just that they have a different perspective. They are morally deficient, they are ethically suspect, and the like. And this is where effective polarization, at least in part, comes from. Polarization is this idea that the poles are pulling apart, that the preferences and the policies offered by the Democratic and Republican parties are becoming further apart. Effective polarization is that individuals within that party view individuals who identify with the other party as morally deficient, as potentially even an existential threat or a threat to their existence. This is profoundly damaging in a society and profoundly damaging to politics. Very often in many elections nowadays, we don't actually see policy at the fore of many voters' minds, many voters' considerations on whom they're going to vote for. Instead, it's this whole idea of winning because my team will win and their team will lose. Therefore, my team and I feel better as a result of that. So it's really let's call it a concerning contemporary development when we're talking about partisanship. But it's something that we've seen and perhaps exacerbated by social media and the internet and the media ecosystem that we've talked about previously. Now, that's from very much the public side of things. Why do individuals, why do people generally associate with political parties? But why are parties valuable to politicians themselves? A lot has been made about this, but fundamentally, the partisan label, that being in the American context, Democrat or Republican, is inherently valuable. And it's inherently valuable because that label carries meaning. When someone says, or a politician says, I am a Democrat or I am a Republican, you probably have a pretty good idea of what policies they are and are not going to vote for, what they are going to support, how they are going to behave, what values they prioritize, or at the very least, give rhetorical basis to. That is enormously valuable for politicians. When we think about the race for the presidency, yeah, there's a lot of attention on that. But what about races for the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate? What about state races? There's a lot less information out there. You know a lot less about the individual politician than those very upper level or high level elections. And as a result, a name that you have never seen before that carries a partisan label, you can actually infer quite a bit about that individual who otherwise you would have no information about. And again, this is very valuable to politicians, but it's not the only source of value for politicians. Parties are very well funded, and more importantly, they have an enormous amount of expertise. If you are a first time candidate and you want to get on the ballot, the party knows how to do that. They know the filing requirements, they know the financial disclosure requirements, they very much can refer you to campaign professionals that will increase your likelihood of actually winning that election. Parties also have grassroots networks of individuals, activists, people who are very motivated about politics to go out and canvass and knock on doors and campaign for the party and, in effect, you as a part of that party. The political parties actually offer a tremendous amount to politicians within the campaigning season itself. What about when they get to office, though? When we look at the composition of the Senate, when we look at the composition of the House, if you go on the Wikipedia page, you will see that it's broken down by party. This is not just an artifact or something of convenience that political pundits and journalists and Wikipedia editors do at a function here. The very functions of government itself in the American context are oriented around parties. In chapter 12, when we talk about the composition and the structure of Congress, we'll see how the leadership in each of the chambers is broken down itself by party. This is fundamentally a manifestation of the idea that you need a majority within these chambers in order to get legislation passed. Returning to the beginning of this lecture, where parties are a collective action mechanism, this party unity, this party cohesive force within these individual chambers allows for a more efficient passage of legislation and a conduct of the business of that chamber, at least in principle. Moreover, where there is this kind of party leadership within each of these chambers, they also coordinate with the party leadership that is not elected, the kind of party officials within the Republican and Democratic national committees. These are the kind of steering committees that organize the business of the party across different institutions. They serve as a linkage mechanism between the presidency and Congress and state governments and governors themselves. Altogether, it serves to put forward a more cohesive and fundamentally more effective means of governance than if it was just 435 representatives and 100 senators all out for self trying to pursue their aims. So while we largely take a negative view of political parties in America, they are endemic. They're not going anywhere. Just because we don't call them parties or something of the like doesn't mean that factions are going to go elsewhere. At its core, political parties are essential in democracies. And moreover, they serve a number of really important functions that make our political system actually function. Or at least that's the idea. So that's all I have for you today. Enjoy the rest of your week, and I will see all of you next time.